99% of financial advice is about tactics. Buy this stock, sell that bond, time the market. But tactics only work when the system works. When Rome fell, when Weimar printed money into dust, when Venezuela's economy vaporized, tactics failed. And if you don't know them before the next collapse, you won't survive it either. This isn't about predicting when the next crisis hits. This is about understanding the mathematical laws that determine who survives and who doesn't when everything breaks. Because history doesn't care about your portfolio. It cares about whether you understand the pattern. Welcome to Financial Detective, where we don't predict the future, we reveal the pattern. Let's start with what most people get catastrophically wrong about wealth. They confuse numbers on a screen with actual value. Your bank balance, your stock portfolio, your government bonds, none of these are wealth. They're claims on wealth. They're promises that someone, somewhere, will pay you. And when the system collapses, promises evaporate. Weimar Germany, 1923, a pensioner with 1 million marks in the bank was a millionaire on paper. But those marks were paper currency backed by a government printing money to pay war debts. When hyperinflation hit, prices doubled every 3.7 days. That million marks went from buying a house to buying a loaf of bread in 6 months. The pensioner starved to death. His wealth was never real. It was a claim on a system that ceased to function. Meanwhile, farmers with land, families with gold, people with physical goods, they survived. Not because they were smarter, because their wealth wasn't a promise. It was tangible. A hectare of farmland produces food regardless of what the currency does. An ounce of gold holds value because it exists, not because a government says it does. Here's the mathematical reality. In every collapse, the wealth gap isn't between rich and poor. It's between people holding hard assets and people holding paper claims. In Argentina, 2001, the banking system froze. ATMs stopped working. Credit cards became worthless. If your wealth was in a bank account, you couldn't access it. The government eventually confiscated deposits to pay debts, a process called a corralito. People with cash, land, or physical inventory could still transact. Everyone else was locked out of their own money. The principle is absolute. Paper wealth is a derivative. It derives value from a functioning system. Hard assets, land, commodities, physical tools, gold hold intrinsic value. They don't need a bank, a government, or a stock market to exist. When Rome fell in 476 AD, Roman currency became worthless overnight. But the estates, the grain stores, the olive groves, those continued producing. The families who owned them remained wealthy. The families who held Roman coins became beggars. This isn't about gold bugs or preppers. This is about understanding what wealth actually is. Wealth is the capacity to meet needs. A claim on wealth is only as good as the institution backing it. And institutions fail constantly throughout history. But there's a deeper layer most people miss. Even within hard assets, there's a hierarchy of survivability. During the 2008 financial crisis, real estate, supposedly a hard asset, collapsed 40% in value. Why? Because it was financialized. Mortgages, derivative, leverage turned physical property into a paper game. The asset was real, but the system around it was fraudulent. When Lehman Brothers failed, housing prices vaporized not because houses disappeared, but because the credit system that inflated them imploded. The lesson: a hard asset entangled in the financial system is only as hard as the system itself. Agricultural land owned outright, with no mortgage, located outside urban areas dependent on complex supply chains. That's a hard asset. A condo in Manhattan with a 90% mortgage and HOA fees dependent on municipal bonds. When the system breaks, the latter becomes worthless. The former keeps producing food. Now let's talk about the difference between assets that produce and assets that appreciate. Most modern wealth is speculative. Bitcoin, art, growth stocks, real estate bought for flipping, all of these depend on someone else paying more than you did. That's not investing. That's gambling on the greater fool theory. A productive asset generates value independent of market price. A farm produces food. A rental property generates shelter and income. A manufacturing facility creates goods. You don't need a bull market to be valuable. Venezuela 2016, inflation hit 800%. The stock market was technically up. Companies were trading at record highs in Bolivar terms, but the Bolivar was collapsing. If you owned stocks, you were getting richer on paper and poorer in reality. The stock market went up 500%, but real purchasing power declined 90%. Speculators who thought they were hedging against inflation were actually still holding paper denominated in a dying currency. Meanwhile, people who owned bakeries, farms, repair shops, they survived because bread is bread. A bakery doesn't care what the bolivar is worth. It produces a good people need, and people will trade whatever they have to get it. The market price is irrelevant. The utility is constant. The mathematical distinction is this: speculative assets have value only in a liquid market with buyers. Productive assets have value in any economy because they fulfill fundamental needs. During the Great Depression, farmland prices collapsed 60%. If you bought land as speculation, you were destroyed. But if you owned land and farmed it, you ate. The market price didn't matter because you weren't selling, you were producing. This is why wealthy families across centuries have always held productive estates, not because they appreciated in value, but because they generated consistent output. Food, timber, livestock, rent. These cash flows survived wars, plagues, currency collapses, and regime changes. The Rothschilds survived European upheaval not primarily through banking, but through vineyards and estates that kept producing regardless of political chaos. The lesson is simple. If your wealth depends on someone else's belief in its value, it's fragile. If your wealth depends on physical production, it's resilient. When markets freeze, speculation dies. But production continues. Here's where it gets even more critical. Not all productive assets are created equal. A factory producing luxury goods is productive until the economy collapses and no one can afford luxuries. Then it's worthless machinery. But a dairy farm producing milk, a workshop repairing tools, a small-scale energy generator, these remain valuable because they address basic, non-discretionary needs. During the collapse of the Soviet Union, state factories shut down. Millions of workers lost their jobs. But small-scale producers, people with vegetable gardens, backyard chickens, basic repair skills, they became the new economy. The distinction wasn't between workers and owners. It was between people producing essentials and people producing non-essentials. When survival becomes the priority, only survival-oriented production matters. The principle extends to modern portfolios. If your investments are in companies producing semiconductors, advertising, or financial services, you're betting on a functioning complex economy. If that economy fragments, your investments vaporize. But investments in water infrastructure, agricultural equipment, basic medical supplies, these retain value because the need for them is permanent, not cyclical. Debt is the most misunderstood financial tool in existence. In a stable, growing economy, debt is leverage. It allows you to control more assets with less capital. Real estate investors use it to build empires. Corporations use it to expand. It can make you rich, but debt is a two-sided blade. In an inflationary collapse, it can save you. In a deflationary collapse, it destroys you. And you never know which type of crisis is coming until it's too late. 1929, United States. The Great Depression was deflationary. Asset prices collapsed. Farmers who had borrowed to expand lost everything. Why? Because their debt stayed constant while the value of their land plummeted. A farmer who owed $10,000 on a farm worth $20,000 suddenly owed $10,000 on a farm worth $5,000. The bank foreclosed. Millions lost their homes, not because they were bad farmers, but because they were leveraged. Contrast this with Germany, 1923. Hyperinflation. If you owed money, inflation wiped out your debt. A mortgage taken in 1920 was paid off with worthless marks by 1920. Debtors became winners, but creditors, people who had lent money, were annihilated. The problem is, you can't predict which scenario unfolds. The Federal Reserve might print money and trigger inflation, or a deflationary credit crunch might collapse asset prices. If you're leveraged and you guess wrong, you're finished. The only safe position is no debt, because debt amplifies whatever happens. If assets rise, you win big. If assets fall, you lose everything. And in a crisis, you can't refinance, you can't sell, and the bank doesn't care about your circumstances. They foreclose. You're gone. This is why the wealthiest families in history avoided debt. The Rockefellers, the Medicis, the old European aristocracy. They held assets outright, not because they couldn't access credit, but because they understood that leverage is risk. And in a collapse, risk is fatal. Modern financial advice tells you to leverage into real estate, to use margin in stocks, to maximize credit. That advice assumes the system stays intact. History says the system breaks regularly, and when it does, the leveraged are the first casualties. There's another dimension to the debt trap that most people miss. The psychological one, debt creates dependency. When you owe money, you can't afford to take risks. You can't leave a job you hate. You can't relocate if opportunities emerge elsewhere. You become a prisoner to your payments. In a stable system, that's manageable. In a collapsing system, that immobility is lethal. When Argentina's economy imploded in 2001, people with debt were trapped. They couldn't flee because their assets were underwater. They couldn't default because the legal system still functioned enough to seize collateral. They were stuck in a dying economy, watching their wealth evaporate. Meanwhile, people with no debt could liquidate, relocate, or adapt. Mobility is survival. Debt is paralysis. This is why the wealthiest families in history avoided debt. The Rockefellers, the Medicis, the old European aristocracy. They held assets outright, not because they couldn't access credit, but because they understood that leverage is risk. And in a collapse, risk is fatal. Modern financial advice tells you to leverage into real estate, to use margin in stocks, to maximize credit. That advice assumes the system stays intact. History says the system breaks regularly, and when it does, the leveraged are the first casualties. There's another dimension to the debt trap that most people miss. The psychological one, debt creates dependency. When you owe money, you can't afford to take risks. You can't leave a job you hate. You can't relocate if opportunities emerge elsewhere. You become a prisoner to your payments. In a stable system, that's manageable. In a collapsing system, that immobility is lethal. When Argentina's economy imploded in 2001, people with debt were trapped. They couldn't flee because their assets were underwater. They couldn't default because the legal system still functioned enough to seize collateral. They were stuck in a dying economy, watching their wealth evaporate. Meanwhile, people with no debt could liquidate, relocate, or adapt. Mobility is survival. Debt is paralysis. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The government stopped paying salaries. The ruble became worthless. Doctors, teachers, engineers, people with advanced degrees starved. Not because they were uneducated, but because their skills were dependent on a functioning system. They needed hospitals, schools, institutions to apply their knowledge. When the institutions vanished, their expertise was useless. But mechanics, plumbers, electricians, they thrived because people always need repairs. A broken pipe doesn't care about the ruble. A car engine doesn't care about the government. Practical skills that solve immediate problems have value in any context. The lesson is brutal, but clear. Wealth that exists outside your body can be taken. Wealth that exists inside your mind cannot. If you can build, fix, heal, or create, you have portable wealth. If you only know how to manage other people's money or analyze spreadsheets, your wealth evaporates the moment the system does. There's a hierarchy of skills in a collapse. At the top, skills that address immediate survival needs. Medical knowledge, mechanical repair, construction, agriculture. These are always in demand. In the middle, skills that provide comfort or efficiency. Cooking, teaching, basic craft work. At the bottom, skills dependent on complex systems. Financial analysis, software engineering for cloud platforms, marketing expertise. When systems collapse, this hierarchy inverts violently. The highest paid skills become worthless. The undervalued skills become priceless. This is why the ultra-wealthy, throughout history, ensured their children learned practical trades, even if they never intended to use them. It wasn't about career planning. It was about survival insurance. A Rockefeller heir might never need to farm, but knowing how to farm meant that if everything collapsed, they could still feed themselves. That knowledge is the ultimate hedge. The final principle is the one modern society has forgotten entirely. Institutions fail, but communities endure. We live in a world where we trust systems, banks, police, hospitals, supply chains to provide for us. But in every collapse, these systems are the first to break. And when they do, the only thing that saves you is the people around you. Soviet Union, 1991. The state stopped functioning. Grocery stores were empty. The military wasn't paid. Police disappeared. On paper, chaos. But life continued. How through barter networks and local communities. A teacher traded lessons for vegetables. A mechanic fixed a car in exchange for bread. Neighbors pooled resources. Extended families supported each other. The people who survived weren't the wealthiest, they were the most connected. This pattern repeats in every collapse. Argentina 2001, Greece 2010. Venezuela 2016. When institutions fail, informal economies emerge. But you can't build a network after the crisis starts. Trust takes years to build. If you don't have relationships before the collapse, you won't survive during it. The principle is reciprocal resilience. If you can provide value to your community will protect you. If you're isolated, wealthy, and dependent on institutions, you're the first target when order breaks down. The rich neighborhoods get looted. The connected neighborhoods organize defense. This isn't about survivalism. It's about the mathematical reality of human cooperation. A lone individual, no matter how wealthy, is vulnerable. A community, even if poor, is resilient. Because humans survive for 200,000 years, not through individual accumulation, but through collective cooperation. In a crisis, your neighbor who can grow food is worth more than your financial advisor. Your friend who can repair generators is worth more than your stock portfolio. The network of people who will trade with you, protect you, and share resources with you, that's your true wealth. And it can't be bought. It has to be built. Here's what most people miss. Networks aren't just about trading goods. They're about information and security. During the Bosnian War in the 1990s, survival wasn't just about having food. It was about knowing which streets were safe, which checkpoints were manned by which factions, where to find water when utilities failed. Isolated families, even wealthy ones with supplies, were vulnerable because they didn't know what was happening beyond their walls. The modern world has replaced community with convenience. You don't know your neighbors because Amazon delivers. You don't need local skills because you can hire services. But convenience is a luxury of stability. When stability breaks, convenience disappears instantly. And if you haven't built relationships when times are good, no one will help you when times are bad. The wealthiest preppers make a fatal error. They assume they can survive alone in a bunker with supplies. History says otherwise. Every isolated stronghold throughout history, castles, fortified estates, gated compounds, eventually fell. Not because they ran out of supplies, but because they were surrounded by people they'd never helped. Communities survive. Individuals, no matter how prepared, become targets. Five principles. 5 laws that have survived every collapse in recorded history. Hard assets over paper. Productive assets over speculative. No debt. Portable skills. Local networks. These aren't theories. In Rome, in Weimar, in the Great Depression, in Argentina, in Venezuela, in every crisis, the people who understood these principles survived. The people who didn't, no matter how wealthy they were before, lost everything. The system you're betting on, the banks, the currency, the government, has collapsed dozens of times across history. And it will collapse again, not because of conspiracy, because that's what systems do. They break. The question isn't if, it's when. And when it happens, tactics won't save you. Only principles will. The pattern is accelerating. The United States is running deficits that cannot be sustained. Global debt is at 315 trillion, 3 times GDP. Central banks are trapped between inflation and deflation. Social trust is collapsing. The warning signs aren't subtle. They're everywhere. But most people are betting that this time is different. But somehow, despite every historical precedent, the system will hold. It won't. And when it breaks, the survivors won't be the ones who believed the promises. They'll be the ones who understood the principles. If you want to understand the next principles that determine survival, subscribe. Because the pattern isn't finished. It's accelerating, and the next collapse won't announce itself. It'll just happen, and by then, it'll be too late to prepare. What's the one principle you're already following? Tell me in the comments.